If we're going to talk about metal giants of this millennium so far, it's hard to overlook Mastodon as one of the biggest and one of the best. Their 2000s run is particularly notable for having two of the most acclaimed metal records of all time, but frankly, even their less loved 2010s material has received as much attention as some bands could ever dream of. With stellar instrumentation, vast narratives, and an unmistakable aesthetic, the band carved a name for themselves in sludge, progressive, and stoner metal throughout their career, and with a new record on the way, I figure what better time than now to get on board. My hope for this video is to give new listeners an idea of where to start and what to expect, and maybe give previous fans of the band some new insight into the music they already love. Much like my Death Grips video, it's going to be broken up into segments, but I don't want to make this as linear as that one. Instead, I'm going to be giving you one record to start with, and then I'll break it into the band's three main sounds that they explored throughout their career, those being the heavy stuff, the proggy stuff, and the more hooky stuff. In that sense, it's going to act a bit more like a flowchart than a direct path through. I still think everything the band has put out is worth listening to, but their sounds are different enough that some stuff just might not appeal to some people. With that being said, let's get started with the record that I think best encapsulates the band's sound as a whole. Leviathan, and in particular the track Blood and Thunder, is the Mastodon that everyone knows. I mean, they have other hits, but I don't think anything really comes close to how massive Blood and Thunder got. Besides that, though, there's a good reason, I think, for me to have this as the definitive starting point for the band, and that's because it perfectly exemplifies every sound that the band had and would use on the rest of their projects. From their sludge metal era, best seen on tracks like Iron Tusk and Island, to their later prog metal stuff seen on Naked Burn, and of course the 13-minute epic Hearts Alive. There's even some of their hookier stuff on here as well, obviously Blood and Thunder, but also just the way a lot of the tracks are constructed with hooky riffs and choruses to make the more proggy and experimental stuff more digestible. It's really good too. It really shows off the band's ability to build cohesive album experiences around a solid narrative, in this case a sludge metal retelling of Moby Dick, without letting it take over and make the whole thing hard to take seriously. On paper, the concept sounds goofy, but the way the band plays into that and really crafts their sound around it gives it the badass and heavy weight implied by the cover. The instrumentals are huge and varied, particularly the drumming. The vocals are diverse but consistent, and the production is detailed without losing the rawness and energy of their previous material. It's regarded as a masterpiece for a reason, and given its super diverse sound, I think there's no better place to start. Notable tracks include Blood and Thunder, Aqua Dementia, and Hearts Alive. So from here, like I said at the beginning, you've actually got three different paths you can take to see the sounds the band explored before and after Leviathan. I'll be showing them in chronological order, but you can definitely take these in whichever order you want, depending on what part of Leviathan's sound you liked the most. For now, let's get started with their earlier heavy stuff. Kicking off our sludgier, heavier segment is the band's first record, Remission from 2002. On this one, the production and instrumentation are significantly more rudimentary, with a much heavier reliance on low-tuned riffs, crushing distortion, and the growled, husky scream we heard a fair bit on Leviathan. There's a fair bit of metalcore influence here, and not in the whiny Avenged Sevenfold or Trivium sense, but more so in the vein of like Converge or something. We've got a lot more intense grooves, and the drums are just going ballistic the whole time, really stealing the show for a lot of it. Something that always strikes me on further listens is how much of the record relies on fuzz bass and other lo-fi guitar tones to give the tracks more dynamic flavor without sacrificing intensity. We do get a few of the expected melodic and acoustic segments like on Ol' Nessie, but a lot of the time the flat level of extreme energy is kept interesting with changes in tone or production rather than melody or instrumentation. It doesn't change the fact that this is absolutely one of the better sludge metal records. It's just something I notice, but it's a great debut for a band that still had a lot of room to grow. Notable tracks include Workhorse, March of the Fire Ants, and Mother Puncher.
I'm talking about God, the devil, hell, heaven. Do you understand? Finally!
But maybe Remission wasn't enough for you. Alright, let's try the absolute heaviest thing Mastodon ever did. Call of the Mastodon is a compilation of some of the band's earliest singles and EPs, coming in at just under 30 minutes in length. What it might lack in relative scale, though, it more than makes up for in just sheer heft and brutality. The metalcore influence on Remission is completely unchained here, with crushing grooves and a focus on intense riff work over everything else. The drumming is even less refined than on Remission, but in a way that aids the feeling of primal intensity this project lives off of. There's also a fair bit of old film sampling here, which we heard a bit on the debut, but it's nearly on every single track here, which gives it a pretty unique place in the discography, I think. The vocals are grosser, the guitars hit harder, the riffs are faster, and despite not being a quote-unquote real album, it manages to have just as much of a spot in my ranking of the group as anything else. Notable tracks include Welcoming War, Shadows That Move, and the title track. Alright, but what if you're looking to be a little bit less of a meathead and maybe even a little sophisticated? You're looking for something weird in a way that's a little less physical and a little more cerebral? Late 2000s Mastodon has you covered. Immediately following Leviathan's release comes the first of our proggy records, and I'll get this out of the way right now. Blood Mountain is an absolute mess. It's got a billion different ideas and no clue how to string them together coherently, and I think sometimes the pretty incredible narrative concept of the record suffers for it, but honestly, I don't even care, because even if those billion ideas don't necessarily work in tandem with each other, they're all flawless on their own, and they result in what may be the most interesting Mastodon record, if nothing else. The influences and stylings on this record are genuinely all over the place, from intense black metal to weird stoner and psych rock, and even like a tinge of freak folk in there at times, all mixed of course with the sludge and prog metal that the band had established on Leviathan and earlier. There's also quite a few hints forwards to the sound that they'd have on their next project, but we'll get there in a second. It's kind of hard to talk briefly about this record because, again, it's so much of a mess and not all that coherent of a project, but frankly, there are so many highlights that I think I might even prefer it to Leviathan slightly. It's probably the worst album, but god, it's so damn fun and so weird. If I can only pick three, I guess I'd say the most notable tracks are Blade Catcher, Colony of Birchmen, and Sleeping Giant. This right here, this is it. This is Mastodon's masterpiece. When I think of best metal albums of all time, even just best albums period, to be honest, this is definitely one of the first to come to mind. It's vast and expansive, it's intimately personal, it's weird without being overbearing, and it's perfectly consistent from front to back. I honestly don't even know where to start. There's just so many little things that make this record stand head and shoulders above the rest of the band's output, be it the clearness and tangibility of the mix that really lets some of the more complex instrumentation shine, or be it the clearer set of prog influences that even pay homage to Rush at a point, that never let the sludgy edge fade. there's much more of an emphasis on melodies and harmonies in the songwriting, and it gives it an almost spiritual sense of scale and importance. The narrative definitely doesn't hurt this, and while it's certainly weirder than the one on Leviathan, I find it a lot easier to follow, delving into much more abstract territory without becoming a pacing mess. This, paired with the emotional backstory to some of the record's themes, including the title track, gives excellent context to the really emotionally powerful sound of the record. This is almost certainly Mastodon's best album, if not, at very least, my favorite. I can't really say too much beyond that. This is just really one of those records that gets better and better every time I listen to it, and it never really stops. It still sometimes blows my mind to this day. I think notable tracks are Oblivion, The Tsar, and The Last Baron. Now, I've been struggling a little bit to figure out what to call this final, most recent leg of the band's career. To be clear, I like all of these albums, but I think any Mastodon fan would agree that there's a pretty substantial difference between the records we've talked about already and these next ones. I've decided on calling them the hooky records, but really I just couldn't find a good label for these more accessible records to fall under. Anyways. Mastodon opened the decade with The Hunter, and response was mixed. After the masterpiece that Cracked the Sky was, this wasn't what people wanted. That's not to say there wasn't anything here that people liked. I think it's pretty unanimously agreed upon that Black Tongue, the opener, is one of the band's better tracks, but there's just kind of a lack of edge on here. Not much here sounds more intense than what you might hear on a rock radio station at the time. With about a decade of hindsight, though, I find myself appreciating this record a lot more than I used to. It's definitely a bit overlong and has a fair few filler tracks, but as a good hard rock album, it doesn't really falter much. The first leg in particular I find to be kind of excellent, with great tracks that have awesome instrumentation keeping it all moving. The great melodies and harmonies of Crack the Sky are also leaned on even more heavily, and while there's never a transcendental moment like in the back half of the Tsar, tracks like Stargasm do get pretty close. I think this record's biggest crime is just that I don't remember a single moment in the back half once it's done. Nothing's offensively bad or even bad at all, but they really did just stick all the best stuff at the front. The highlights soar, but there's definitely this feeling to me that they wrote a few of these tracks to fill time. Still a good record though, and definitely not to be skipped, especially for notable tracks like Black Tongue, Stargasm, and Curl of the Burl. Alright, so take all the positive stuff I said about The Hunter, great melodies and tight songwriting, and combine it with some of the progressive and narrative-driven stuff from Crack the Sky, and you've pretty much got Once More Around the Sun, and it's great. Yeah, it's kind of a neutered version of Crack the Sky, but honestly, just the association is enough to bring this up to one of the better Mastodon records, and definitely the best in this more hook-driven leg of the band's career. A big part of that for me is just how great the instrumentation is here. Mastodon never slouches on the riffs and solos, of course, but here it feels like they really kicked it up a notch. High Road shows that the band still has a grasp on how to write a crushing riff, the opener is blisteringly fast and performed immaculately, and the Motherlode gives the band's poppiest song maybe their coolest solo, which is simply unfair, but it works perfectly here. This record still suffers slightly from the same issue as The Hunter in that the later tracks stand out less and less as the record goes on, but I still think even those tracks are super strong, in particular the Queens of the Stone Age Worship on Halloween. There's not much else to say for this one. It's certainly not the most substantive record in the band's discography, but I also don't see what's not to love. Notable tracks include The Motherlode, High Road, and Halloween.
Show yourself, show
We've reached the last Mastodon album, and it's pretty divisive. If they don't say The Hunter, this is definitely what many fans of the band would call their sellout moment. With a listen to big single Show Yourself, it might be easy to see why, and while it's certainly not one of my favorite of the band's records, I'm here to make a case for it. I think that while Emperor of Sand is probably the quote-unquote worst Mastodon album, the onus of that doesn't rest on the songwriting or instrumentation almost at all. In fact, in that regard, I might put it above projects like Once More Around the Sun. Take the track Precious Stones, for example. In a lot of ways, this track is as progressive and melodically interesting as some of their earlier material. The only difference is that the track has a pretty standard verse-chorus-verse structure, but even that, I feel, acts as a great balance of early and later Mastodon. Steam Breather has an awesome and heavy guitar riff that drives the track forward through its climactic chorus, and that brings to light one of my favorite parts of the record, the choruses. Not since Crack the Sky has the band so well mastered a hook in a metal track, and while nothing here is as interesting as on that record, it's still more than serviceable. So what's the problem? Well, frankly, this album doesn't sound very good. The mix is all out of whack most of the time, with guitar riffs getting squished and sounding muddy and getting totally drowned out by the drums, and oh god, the drums. Put bluntly, the drums on this album sound like shit. They're so overproduced to the point that I often found them nearly ruining key moments of tracks with how thin and slippery they sounded, and they're mixed so annoyingly loud that I can't drown them out and pay attention to anything else. So yeah, the last Mastodon record is one of the weaker ones, but I want to reiterate that worst Mastodon album is still a bar many bands wish they could clear, and the band hasn't put out a record I don't at least really like, this one included. Notable tracks include Show Yourself, Andromeda, and Steam Breather. And that's pretty much it. Unlike with Death Grips, there isn't a ton of extra stuff to dig through besides the albums. The early EPs are covered by Call of the Mastodon. They've got 2 fairly good live albums if that's your thing. There's an EP called Cold Dark Place, which is pretty good, but not really worth talking about at length. And the members of the band don't really have side projects of any major note, with the exception of vocalist Troy Sanders' role in the supergroup Killer Be Killed, which is a fairly decent groove metal record that's kinda more interesting for its lineup of members than in the actual music. Other than that, though, I guess it's time for some final thoughts, of which I don't have a ton, but I kind of just want to stress that while I definitely have my own preference for eras of the band, I don't think there's a single record here that is anything less than really good. I think a lot of people dismiss later Mastodon as pop metal, but I hope this video at least gives some sort of perspective on why that's not really all that accurate and kind of undersells some of the band's most interesting material in the process. Mastodon, throughout their career, has remained a cornerstone of modern metal, and I think now, with an album on the way, it's the perfect time to get in.